Found inside a crashed car, buried in sand after 26 years, a family's fate finally revealed. The wind, a relentless sculptor, had worked for 26 years, a quarter-century of howling, patient artistry, piling grain upon golden grain, until the California desert swallowed a secret whole. Now, the machines were here to undo its work. The churn of the excavator's engine was a profane roar in the sacred silence of the Mojave, its steel bucket clawing at the dune with a brutalism that felt like a violation. Sheriff Alistair Finch stood with his boots sinking into the loose sand, the sun, a merciless hammer on the back of his neck. He tasted grit in his teeth. It had been a freak tip-off, a rambling call from a meth head confessing his sins to a 911 operator, talking about a car he'd helped bury decades ago. A bad debt, a bad man, a family that vanished. Alistair hadn't expected to find anything. The desert was vast, its memory long, but its landmarks ephemeral. Yet, here they were, guided by the sun-bleached skeleton of a Joshua tree the addict had described. A landmark that had somehow defied the years. "Got something, Sheriff." A young deputy, Calloway, yelled over the engine's growl. His voice was sharp with a mixture of excitement and dread. The excavator's bucket lifted, and for a moment, it was just more sand, a cascade of gold. But then, a shape. A glint of unnatural color. Not the rust red of rock or the bleached white of bone, but a faded, oxidized blue. The blue of a 1998 Ford Explorer. Alistair's breath caught. He remembered the posters, the milk cartons, the desperate, tear-streaked face of a grandmother on the local news, begging for any word about her son, her daughter-in-law, and her 2 little grandchildren. The Miller family vanished without a trace on a drive back from a camping trip near 29 Palms. The case had been his predecessor's great failure, a ghost that haunted the department, a testament to the desert's power to erase. "Easy now, Alistair," commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Hand shovels only. I want every inch of this preserved." The air grew thick with a tension that was more than just the oppressive heat. The deputies worked with a grim, focused energy, their shovels whispering against the sand. The car emerged slowly, like a fossil being coaxed from ancient stone. The roof, then the windows, their glass miraculously intact, though clouded with a fine, permanent dust. The driver's side door, its handle pitted with rust. It was a tomb, sealed by time and sand. Alistair felt a prickle of cold sweat on his forehead, a stark contrast to the baking heat. He'd seen death in every form. This desert could devise dehydration, exposure, violence. But this was different. This was a mystery locked in a steel box. A story that had been waiting 26 years to be told. The driver's side window was the first to be cleared. Alistair leaned in, his heart a heavy rhythmic drum against his ribs. He wiped a gloved hand across the dusty glass, peering into the gloom within. The interior was a time capsule of domesticity and horror. A child's stuffed giraffe, its neck bent at an unnatural angle, lay on the dashboard, its plastic eyes staring into nothing. A half-empty bag of potato chips was crumpled on the passenger seat. But it was the figures that made the air flee. Alistair's lungs, 2 skeletons sat in the front seats, held upright by seatbelts that had long since fused with the fabric of their decayed clothing. The driver, presumably Michael Miller, was slumped against the wheel, his skeletal hands still resting near the horn, as if in a final silent plea. The passenger, his wife Sarah, was turned slightly towards him. Her jaw agape in a scream the sand had muffled for decades. "God have mercy," Calloway whispered, his face pale beneath his tan. But it was the back seat that held the true, gut-wrenching horror. 2 smaller skeletons, nestled together. The older child, a boy named Noah, had his bony arms wrapped around his little sister, Lily. They were huddled against the far door, as if trying to shrink away from something, or someone, in the front. A small silver locket, tarnished and black, lay tangled in the girl's ribcage. Alistair's stomach churned. This wasn't just a crash. This wasn't a family that had simply lost its way and succumbed to the elements. The scene screamed of something else, Something more sinister. The way they were positioned, the silent tableau of their final moments. It felt staged. It felt wrong. "Get the forensics team out here now," Alistair ordered, his voice strained. "I want this whole area cordoned off. Nobody touches anything until they arrive." He stepped back from the car. The image of the huddled children burned into his mind. He'd been a rookie when they disappeared, a fresh-faced kid who'd handed out flyers at the county fair. He remembered the grandmother, Eleanor Vance, a woman of iron will and bottomless grief, who had hounded the department for years, refusing to let her family's memory fade. She had to be in her late 70s now, if she was even still alive. Someone would have to tell her. The thought made him feel ill. The forensics team arrived in a whirlwind of white vans and quiet professionalism. They moved with a practiced, somber grace, setting up lights, unfurling evidence markers, their voices low and technical. Alistair watched them work, feeling like a ghost at his own crime scene. This case was older than half the deputies on his force. Hours bled into one another. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, colors too beautiful for the grim reality on the ground. The team had managed to pry open the driver's side door, its hinges groaning in protest. The air that escaped was stale, thick with the scent of decay and dust and time itself. One of the forensic techs, a woman named Ramirez with sharp, intelligent eyes, called him over. She was pointing at the floor of the driver's side, near the pedals. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Alistair knelt, his old knees protesting. He followed her gloved finger. There, half buried in the accumulated sand and debris on the floor, Matt, was a small rectangular object. It wasn't a wallet. It wasn't a phone from that era. It was a digital voice recorder, a small, silver Olympus model that was popular in the late 90s. His heart hammered. A voice recorder, carefully. He breathed. "Bag it. I want it sent to the lab tonight. Top priority. This could be it." The key. The story of what happened in this car. In their own words, as the last of the light faded, the scene was illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of portable floodlights. The car looked skeletal itself under the stark light, a metal carcass, picked clean by the desert. The team was now working on the rear passenger door, the one the children were huddled against. It was jammed shut, the metal warped. They used a crowbar. The sound of screeching metal echoed across the silent expanse. With a final, violent pop, the door swung open, and that's when everything changed. The initial assessment had been based on the view through the windows. 2 adults in the front, 2 children in the back. A family of 4. It was what everyone had believed for 26 years. But as the door opened, revealing the interior of the back seat in its full, unobscured horror, it was clear the initial assessment was wrong. There weren't 2 skeletons in the back. There were 3. Tucked beneath the bodies of Noah and Lily, almost completely hidden from view, was a third, smaller skeleton. An infant. So small, its bones were like a bird's, fragile and impossibly delicate. It was wrapped in a tattered, faded pink blanket. No one had ever reported a third child. The Millers had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. That was the official record. That was the story. Alistair stared, his mind struggling to process the information. A secret baby. Why? Where did it come from? Then Ramirez, who was carefully examining the infant's remains, let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. She looked up at Alistair, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling. "Look at the skull. Just above the temple." Alistair leaned closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He saw it immediately. A small, perfectly round hole. A hole that was not the result of decay or animal activity. It was precise, unmistakable. A bullet hole. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the generator. The wind had died down, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. A family of 4 had vanished. But a family of 5 had been found. And one of them, a baby no one knew existed, had been executed. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a massacre. Alistair stood up, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The car, the bodies, the endless, indifferent desert. Every assumption he'd ever made about this case, every theory his predecessors had chased, had just been obliterated. The story wasn't about a family getting lost, it was about something they were running from. Something that had caught up to them in the most brutal way imaginable. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. He looked at the skeletons in the front seat, at Michael and Sarah Miller. Were they victims? Or were they something else? The methed's confession had mentioned a bad man. But what if the bad man wasn't the one who buried the car? What if he was already inside it? The cliffhanger wasn't just about what had happened here. It was about who these people truly were. The sand had hidden the car, but the family had been hiding a secret far deeper and darker. And as Alistair stood there, under the cold, unblinking stars, he knew that digging up this car hadn't ended a mystery. It had just begun a new, more terrifying one. The real excavation, the one into the lives and lies of the Miller family, was only now getting started. The first person Alistair had to face was the ghost, Eleanor Vance. He found her in a small, tidy bungalow in a dusty corner of Barstow, a place that seemed to be perpetually waiting for a train that never came. The house smelled of lavender and old paper. Eleanor was 81, a woman carved from granite and grief, her eyes the pale washed-out blue of a desert sky. They were eyes that had not truly seen joy in 26 years. She sat opposite him in a floral armchair, her hands gnarled with arthritis, resting on a polished wooden cane. She had received his call with a stoic calm that was more unsettling than tears. She had been waiting for this day, in one form or another, for nearly a third of her life. "You found them?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Alistair said softly. "We found the car." He watched her absorb the words. There was no theatrical gasp, no collapse. Just a slow, deep intake of breath, a subtle tightening of her grip on the cane. This was a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "My son, Michael," she began, her voice raspy with disuse. "And Sarah." "The children." Alice's throat felt tight. This was the part he dreaded. How do you tell a grandmother that her grandchildren's last moments were spent cowering in terror? How do you tell her there was another child, a secret one, who was murdered? He couldn't not. Yet, the investigation had to come first. They were all in the vehicle, Eleanor, it appears. It appears they ran off the road during a storm, and were buried by a sand drift. We believe they passed from exposure. It was a lie, a necessary, temporary cruelty. He could see the flicker of something in her eyes, not relief, but a kind of grim acceptance. The narrative he offered was tragic, but it was a simple tragedy. It was a story that had an ending. It closed the book. Exposure, she repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. All that time, just waiting, in the dark. Alistair nodded, feeling like a fraud. The desert can be unforgiving. He needed to know about their lives, about the people they were, not the sainted victims of public memory. "Eleanor, I need to ask you some questions about Michael and Sarah. Things that might not have seemed important back then." She looked at him, her gaze sharpening. The grief was still there, a vast empty landscape behind her eyes, but now, there was a flicker of the old fire. The fire that had driven her to hound his predecessor for years. "I told Sheriff Brody everything," she said. "Michael was a good boy, a bit of a dreamer, always chasing some new idea, some get-rich-quick scheme, but he loved his family. He adored Sarah, and Sarah," Alistair pressed gently. "What was she like?" Eleanor's lips thinned. A shadow crossed her face, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of her memory. Sarah was complicated, beautiful, like a desert flower, but delicate. She came from money, you see. A family back east. The kind of money that has lawyers and trusts and expectations. They never approved of Michael. They thought he was beneath her. Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might have wished her harm? The old woman scoffed, a dry rattling sound. Her father, probably. Richard Davenport. A monster in $1,000 suit. He cut her off without a penny when she married Michael. Said she'd made her bed and could lie in it. He never even met his own grandchildren. Richard Davenport. The name sent a jolt through Alistair. He was a titan of industry. A name that occasionally appeared in the financial pages. A man who moved in circles of unimaginable wealth and power. And he was Sarah Miller's father. The estranged antagonist. Did Michael have any business dealings that might have gone sour? Alistair asked, thinking of the meth head's confession about a bad debt. Always, Eleanor said with a sigh. He was involved in some land deal out near the dunes where you found them. Said it was going to be the next big thing. A resort, or something foolish. He partnered with a man named Marcus Thorne, a slick character, the kind of man who smiles while he's shaking your hand and sizing you up for a coffin. Marcus Thorne. Another name, another thread. The partner, Thorne. Eleanor spat, the name leaving a bitter taste. He came around after they disappeared. All condolences and crocodile tears. Offered to buy out Michael's share of the land for a pittance, to help with the estate. I told him to go to hell. Alistair's mind was racing. A wealthy, disapproving father. A slick business partner. A secret, murdered baby. This was a constellation of secrets. And the Miller family was at its center. He spent another hour with Eleanor, gently probing the past. He learned of Sarah's isolation, her quiet sadness, her occasional cryptic phone calls where she sounded distant and afraid. He learned of Michael's growing desperation, the mounting debts, the pressure to prove himself to a wife who was used to a world he could never provide. But there was someone else, a hidden witness. Alistair found her name buried deep in the original case file, a footnote in a long list of dead-end interviews. A name, Chloe Benson. She had been Sarah Miller's best friend, the maid of honor at her wedding. The last person known to have spoken to Sarah before the family vanished. The original report said she'd been uncooperative, distraught, and had moved away shortly after the disappearance. It took Alistair 2 days and a favor from a friend in the DMV to find her. She was living in a cramped apartment in Las Vegas, a city that fed on broken dreams. When he knocked on her door, the woman who answered was a ghost of a different kind. The years had not been kind to Chloe Benson. Her face was etched with the fine lines of anxiety. Her eyes darted nervously, as if expecting a blow. She was a woman who had been running from something for a very long time. "I'm Sheriff Finch," he said, holding up his badge. "I'm here about the Miller family." The color drained from her face. She swayed, gripping the doorframe for support. They found them." "Yes," Alistair said. "We need to talk." She let him in, her movements stiff and robotic. The apartment was sparse, transient. A place to hide, not to live. She sank onto a worn-out sofa, wrapping her arms around herself. "I told the other sheriff everything I knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think you held something back," Alistair said, his tone gentle but firm. "Chloe, we know how they died. We know it wasn't an accident. We found a third child in that car. A baby that was murdered." A sob tore from Chloe's throat, a raw, ragged sound of guilt and grief that had been locked away for years. The dam broke. The truth, or at least her part of it, came flooding out in a torrent of tears and fractured sentences. "It was my fault," she wept, her body shaking. "I should have said something. I should have stopped them." "Stop them from what, Chloe?" "From running," she cried. "Sarah called me the night they left." She was terrified. She wasn't making any sense. She was talking about a mistake, a terrible mistake that was going to destroy them all. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with a fear that was still fresh, still potent. "It wasn't Michael's baby," she whispered, the words hanging in the air like poison. "The baby, the third child, it wasn't his, it was Marcus Thorne's." Alistair felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The slick business partner. The get-rich-quick scheme. It wasn't just about land, it was about an affair, a secret child. A motive for murder that was as old as time itself. Sarah was going to leave Michael. Chloe continued, her voice trembling. She was going to take the children and the new baby and go to her father, Richard Davenport. She was finally going to beg for his help. She believed Marcus would help her. He had promised her a new life. He was supposed to meet them out in the desert, give them money, a car, a way out. The scene in the desert replayed in Alistair's mind, but now, with horrifying clarity. The family wasn't running from a stranger. They were driving to a rendezvous, a trap. But Michael found out. Chloe choked out. He found out about the affair, about the baby. He heard her on the phone with Marcus. He went crazy, he said. He said if he couldn't have her, nobody could. Alistair's blood ran cold. The meth head's confession. A bad man, he hadn't been talking about Marcus Thorne. He had been talking about Michael Miller. Sarah called me from a payphone, Chloe said, her face buried in her hands. She was whispering. She said Michael had a gun. He was forcing them to drive out to meet Marcus anyway. He said he was going to settle things once and for all. He was going to make Marcus pay for what he'd done. And then the line went dead. The hidden witness, crippled by fear. The antagonist, a ruthless businessman and secret lover. And the victim was not a victim at all. Michael Miller, the grieving public's sainted son, was a monster. He hadn't been trying to save his family. He had been leading them to their graves. The injustice wasn't just the murder. It was the lie that had protected the killer's memory for 26 years. While the real villain, Marcus Thorne, walked free, his hands clean, his secret buried under a mountain of sand. Alistair now knew the players. But the game was far more twisted than he could ever have imagined. The desert wind that night felt different to Alistair. It no longer whispered of secrets, it howled with them. The narrative had been ripped apart. Michael Miller wasn't the victim. He was the catalyst, a man driven to madness by betrayal. Sarah wasn't just a wife. She was a woman caught between a desperate husband and a powerful lover. And Marcus Thorne, the slick business partner, was now the prime suspect in a quadruple homicide. Alistair's first move was to bring Thorne in. He found him not in a dusty desert town, but in a sprawling glass-walled mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Newport Beach. Marcus Thorne, at 62, was the picture of success. Silver hair, a deep tan, a handshake that was firm, and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He radiated an aura of untouchable power. He met Alistair in his study, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of leather and money. He offered the sheriff a drink, which Alistair declined. Thorne didn't seem surprised or nervous. He seemed amused. "Sheriff Finch," Thorne began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I was sorry to hear about the Millers. A true tragedy. I'd almost forgotten about poor Michael. It's been a long time." 26 years is a long time, Alistair agreed, his voice level. "Long enough for a secret to fester. We found a third child in the car, Mr. Thorne, an infant." Thorne's smile didn't waver, but Alistair saw a flicker, a micro-expression, of something cold and sharp in his eyes. A predator scenting danger. "Is that so?" Thorne said, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "How tragic. I had no idea they had another." "The baby wasn't Michael's," Alistair said, watching him closely. "We have a witness who says the child was yours." The mask finally slipped. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter contempt. Thorne placed his glass down with a soft click. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with menace. "A witness," he sneered. "Some drug-addled whore from Vegas." Chloe Benson was always unstable. "Obsessed with Sarah, you have nothing." "We have a motive," Alistair countered. "Sarah was leaving Michael. She was coming to you. But Michael found out. He took his family into the desert to confront you." "What happened out there, Marcus?" Thorne laughed. A harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the silent room. "You're building a fantasy, Sheriff." Michael Miller was a pathetic, bankrupt loser who couldn't handle the truth. He probably snapped and killed them all himself before taking the coward's way out. It happens every day. The cruelty was breathtaking. The casual dismissal of 4 lives, one of them his own child. Alistair felt a surge of cold fury. He knew Thorne was lying. The bullet hole in the infant's skull wasn't the mark of a frantic, suicidal father. It was the work of an executioner. Michael might have been the catalyst, but Thorne was the triggerman. You were supposed to meet them that night, Alistair pressed. Chloe says you promised Sarah a new life. Promises are for fools, Thorne said, turning to look out the vast window at the ocean. Sarah was a beautiful, foolish woman who made a bad decision marrying that worthless piece of trash. She came to me for comfort. I provided it. That's all. When she started talking about a future, about complications, I ended it. I told her to go back to her husband, that I wanted nothing to do with her or her pathetic life. It was a betrayal of stunning proportions. He hadn't just abandoned her, he had thrown her back to the wolf. He had sentenced her, and her children, to death. So you just let her go? Alistair asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You knew her husband was unstable. You knew she was terrified. And you did nothing. Thorne turned back, his face a mask of bored indifference. It wasn't my problem. My life, my reputation, was not going to be destroyed by some small-town drama. I had a career to build, a wife, a family of my own. Sarah Miller and her brood were a loose end. And I don't leave loose ends. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He hadn't just abandoned them, he had cleaned up the mess. But Alistair had no proof. It was Thorne's word, against the testimony of a frightened, guilt-ridden woman. It wasn't enough. Thorne knew it. He was toying with him, enjoying his power, his immunity. Unless you have a warrant. Sheriff, this interview is over, Thorne said, picking up his glass again. And you will never get one. The past is buried. Let it stay that way. The injustice was a physical weight in Alistair's chest. Thorne was going to walk away, just as he had 26 years ago. He was going to return to his perfect life, built on a foundation of bodies and secrets. Meanwhile, Alistair had to deliver the amended truth to Eleanor Vance. This was the conversation he dreaded even more. He sat with her again in her quiet, lavender-scented living room. This time, he told her everything. The affair, the secret baby, Michael's rage, Chloe's story, Marcus Thorne's denial. He watched the granite of her composure crack, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing grind. The woman who had mourned a tragic victim now had to face the reality of her son as a violent, jealous monster. The woman who had despised her daughter-in-law's family now had to accept that Sarah had been trying to escape. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide with denial. Not my Michael. He wouldn't, he couldn't. Eleanor, Alistair said gently. The evidence. What evidence? She shot back, the old fire returning, now fueled by a desperate need to protect her son's memory. The word of a coward who let her friend die. The word of that snake, Thorne. You are desecrating my son's name based on lies. She was turning on him, the only person trying to find the real truth. The betrayal was a fresh wound on top of a lifetime of grief. She saw him not as a rescuer, but as a defiler of memory. The public, too, was starting to turn. The story had leaked. A heroic sheriff finds the long-lost Miller family. The local news painted Michael as a tragic hero who died trying to save his family from the unforgiving desert. A memorial fund was started. The lie was becoming canon, solidified by public sentiment. Alistair felt the case slipping through his fingers. He was a small-town sheriff against a powerful millionaire and a grieving mother who refused to believe the truth. The system was protecting Thorne. Public opinion was protecting Michael. And Sarah, Noah, Lily, and the unnamed baby were being silenced all over again. The only person left who knew the truth, besides Thorne, was Chloe Benson. Alistair went back to Vegas, hoping to find something more, some piece of evidence she might have forgotten. He found her apartment empty. The landlord said she'd packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. 2 days after Alistair's first visit, she had left a note for him, a single folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter. He knows, you talked to me. I'm sorry. I can't. I'm not strong enough. Thorn had gotten to her, not with violence, but with fear. A phone call, a veiled threat, a reminder of what he was capable of. He had silenced the only witness. The conflict wasn't just escalating. It was collapsing. Thorn was bolder, more untouchable than ever. The victims were being forgotten, their true story buried under a new layer of lies. And the witness, the last flicker of conscience in this dark tale, had been extinguished, swallowed by the fear that had haunted her for 26 years. Alistair was alone, fighting a ghost, a millionaire, and a lie the world wanted to believe. The tension was no longer just rising, it was suffocating. He felt like he was being buried alive, right alongside the Miller family. Alistair was adrift in a sea of dead ends. Thorn was untouchable, protected by his wealth and a wall of high-priced lawyers. Chloe was gone, vanished into the ether of fear. Eleanor was a fortress of denial, poisoning the well of public opinion against him. The official narrative was, hardening into accepted fact, Michael Miller, tragic victim. The truth felt like a ghost only he could see. He was losing. He spent his nights poring over the case files, the old ones and the new, searching for a crack, a sliver of light. The forensics report on the Ford Explorer sat on his desk, a monument to his frustration. He'd read it a dozen times. Cause of death for Michael Serra and the two older children was undetermined due to decomposition, but consistent with exposure. The infant, however, was a different story. Gunshot wound to the head, small caliber. The bullet was not recovered. And then there was the digital voice recorder. The lab had managed to salvage it. A miracle of technology. But the result was just another dead end. The recorder's memory was corrupted, damaged by 26 years of temperature fluctuations and magnetic degradation. They had recovered only fragments of audio. Static, the cry of a baby, a few garbled words that were impossible to decipher. It was a tantalizing whisper from the past, but it was inadmissible, meaningless. Another ghost. Defeated, Alistair drove out to the impound lot, where the Explorer was being stored. He needed to see it again, to stand before the tomb, and force it to give up its secrets. The lot was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered glass, bathed in the harsh glare of sodium lamps. The Explorer sat in a quarantined corner, a relic from another time. He opened the driver's door, the groan of the hinges like a sigh of protest. The smell of dust and decay hit him again. He sat in the driver's seat, the seat where Michael Miller had died. He stared through the dusty windshield at the chain-link fence of the impound lot, trying to imagine what Michael had seen in his final moments. An endless sea of sand. A sky full of cold, indifferent stars. His hand rested on the steering wheel. He thought of the skeletons, the way they were positioned. Michael slumped forward. Sarah turned towards him. The children, huddled in the back, trying to get away from the front seat. Away from their father. But something was wrong with that picture. If Michael was the monster, if he had a gun and was in a homicidal rage, why were the children not shot? Why only the infant? It didn't make sense. A man who snaps, who is determined that if I can't have you, nobody can, doesn't typically stop at one victim, he annihilates. Alistair's frustration mounted. He slammed his hand on the dashboard in anger. A cloud of ancient dust puffed up, and something fell. A small plastic rectangle, dislodged by the impact, clattered onto the floor mat. It was a cassette tape. His heart stopped. A cassette tape, not a digital recorder. An old-school analog cassette. It must have been in the dashboard compartment, a flimsy plastic drawer that the forensics team had likely overlooked or dismissed as empty. He picked it up with a trembling hand. The label was handwritten. The ink faded but still legible. It said, "For Eleanor, I'm sorry." It was from Michael, a confession, a suicide note. Alistair raced back to his office, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had to dig through a storage closet to find a cassette player, a dusty relic from a forgotten era. He slid the tape in, the plastic door clicking shut. With a sound he hadn't heard in years. He put on a pair of headphones, isolating himself from the world. He pressed play. The sound of static filled his ears, then the hiss of blank tape. His hope began to fade. Maybe it was empty. Maybe it was just as corrupted as the digital recorder. And then, a voice. Michael Miller's voice. It was shaky, terrified, broken by sobs. Mum, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry. I messed up. I messed everything up. Alistair leaned forward, his entire being focused on the voice in his ears. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Michael wept. The land deal, it was all a sham. Marcus, he didn't want the land, he wanted the water rights. There's an aquifer under that sand, Mum, worth billions. He forged my name on documents, signed away our future, I found out. I was going to expose him. The plot twisted, reforming into something new and monstrous. It wasn't about an affair. That was a lie. A cover story. A brilliant, cruel piece of misdirection. Sarah didn't have an affair. Michael's voice cracked. That's what he told me. He called me. He said she was cheating. That the baby wasn't mine. He wanted to break me, to discredit me. Before I could go to the authorities, he sent me a picture. A picture of Sarah and him, doctored. I know it was, but I was so angry, so hurt. I went crazy. I believed him. Thorne hadn't just betrayed Sarah. He had psychologically tortured Michael. He had manufactured the very scenario that would make Michael look like a jealous, murderous husband. He had framed him for his own murder. He told us to meet him in the desert, Michael continued, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He said he'd give us money to disappear, to start over. He said it was the only way. For Sarah's sake, for the kids. I was so confused. I didn't know what to believe, but I had to go. I had to face him. I took the gun, my hunting rifle. I was going to scare him, make him tell the truth. The sound of a baby crying softly entered the recording. Lily, her name was Lily. We got there, Michael said, his breathing ragged. He was waiting, he wasn't alone. There was another man, they had shovels. He smiled at me, Mom. That cold, dead smile. He said he was sorry it had to be this way, that I was a loose end. Alistair's blood ran cold. He could hear the scene unfolding, the horror building in Michael's voice. He admitted it all. The forgery, the water rights. He laughed about it. Hissed, nobody would ever believe me. He pointed to Sarah, to the baby. He said, who are they going to believe? A bankrupt fool, or the man whose wife you were sleeping with? He'd built my coffin and handed me the nails. The sound of a car door opening, then a woman's scream. Sarah, he went for Sarah first. Michael sobbed, the sound raw and agonizing. The other man grabbed me, held me. Marcus. Oh God, Marcus. He took the baby from her. He took Lily. Sarah was begging, screaming. He just looked at her. And he shot the baby. He shot my little girl right in front of her. Alistair squeezed his eyes shut, the image searing his mind. This was the execution. Cold, precise. A message. He killed her to silence Sarah. Michael's voice choked. Then he came for me. I fought. I tried. I got the rifle. I shot the other man. I think I killed him. Marcus ran, got in his car and drove away, leaving us there. Leaving us to die. The full conspiracy, laid bare in a dead man's final words. Thorne hadn't just murdered them, he had engineered a scenario where he could commit the perfect crime. He had a motive to kill Michael, the water rights. He created a cover story, the affair. He lured them to a remote location. He murdered the infant to terrorize and silence Sarah. And he left Michael, armed and enraged, to be framed as the killer. He had even called in the tip himself, years later, through a meth head proxy, to make sure the bodies were found and his version of the story was cemented. The car is stuck. Michael's voice said, now flat, devoid of emotion. The voice of a man already dead. The storm. The sand. It's rising. We're not getting out. I'm so tired. The kids, they're sleeping now. Sarah, she hasn't said a word since the tape hissed for a few moments. Noah and Lily's story, Michael whispered, his last words a desperate plea. Don't let him win. Don't let him erase us. The real papers, the proof of the forgery, they're not with me. Too dangerous. I gave them to the only person I could trust. The only one who knew Marcus was a monster from the start. I gave them to Chloe. The tape clicked off. Alistair ripped the headphones off, his mind reeling. Chloe, she hadn't been running from guilt. She had been running with the evidence. She wasn't a hidden witness. She was the secret keeper. Thorn wasn't just hunting her to silence her. He was hunting her to get the documents that could destroy him. The stakes had just exploded. This was no longer about a family tragedy. It was about a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy, a cold-blooded execution, and a cover-up of breathtaking evil. The tension wasn't just at its maximum. It had breached the very limits of what Alistair thought possible. He had the truth. A dead man's voice on a forgotten cassette tape. And now, he had to find Chloe Benson before Marcus Thorn did. The race was on. The cassette tape changed everything. It was the voice of the dead, a key forged in tragedy. Alistair knew a DA would still call it hearsay, a defense attorney would tear it apart, but it was more than evidence, it was a map. It led to the real treasure, the documents Chloe was protecting. He had to find her. He put out a bolo, but discreetly, flagging it for his eyes only. He didn't want Thorn's people in law enforcement to be alerted. He ran her financials, her phone records, anything that could leave a digital footprint. Nothing. Chloe Benson had become a ghost. He went back to her apartment in Vegas. A long shot. He spoke to the landlord again, to the neighbors. He was looking for anything, a stray comment, a destination mentioned in passing. An old woman who lived across the hall remembered something. Poor dear, she'd said, always looked so scared. Mentioned she had family up north, near Bodie. A sister, I think. Said she might go see her, get away from the city. Bodie, the ghost town, a place of ruins and memories preserved in a state of arrested decay. It was poetic. It was the perfect place to hide. Alistair drove through the night, the stark, lunar landscape of the eastern Sierras flying past his window. He felt a primal urgency, a hunter's focus. He was not just a sheriff anymore, he was an avenger. He found her in a small, weathered cabin a few miles outside the historic park, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Her sister confirmed she was there, terrified, refusing to see anyone. Alistair didn't give her a choice. He found Chloe huddled by a small fireplace, looking even more fragile than before. When she saw him, her eyes filled with terror. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "He'll kill us all. He'll win if you do nothing," Alistair said, his voice low and intense. He didn't tell her about the tape. Not yet. He needed her trust. "Chloe, I know what you're protecting." Michael's last words weren't for his mother. They were for you. He trusted you. Her composure broke. The story she'd held back, the final piece of the puzzle, came pouring out. Michael, frantic and terrified, had come to her the day before they disappeared. He gave her a thick manila envelope, sealed with tape. He told her it was insurance. He made her promise that if anything happened to him, she would take it to the authorities. "But I was scared," she wept. "After they vanished, Thorn's men came to see me. They didn't threaten me, not directly. They were polite. They just told me it would be in my best interest to forget I ever knew the Millers. To move on, I knew what they meant. So I ran, and I've been running ever since." "Where is it, Chloe?" Alistair asked. "Where is the envelope?" She led him to a loose floorboard beneath an old rug. From the dark space beneath, she pulled out a dusty, yellowed manila envelope. Alistair's hands trembled as he took it. Inside were the original land deeds, the forged water rights contracts, bearing Michael's forged signature, and a sworn affidavit from a geologist Michael had hired, detailing the existence of the aquifer and its immense value. It was the smoking gun. It was everything. The payoff had to be cinematic. It had to be public. It had to be a spectacle of justice that would burn Marcus Thorn's empire to the ground. A quiet arrest wouldn't be enough. Alistair wanted to detonate a bomb in the center. Of Thorne's perfect life, Thorne was hosting his annual charity gala. A lavish affair at his Newport Beach mansion for the state's rich and powerful. The governor was scheduled to speak. It was the pinnacle of Thorne's public image, the jewel in his crown of philanthropic hypocrisy. It was the perfect stage. Alastair coordinated with the state attorney general, a man he knew to be ambitious and ruthless. He played him the tape. He showed him the documents. The AG's eyes lit up. This wasn't just a murder case. It was the kind of high-profile, public corruption scandal that could make a career. The night of the gala was a blur of flashing cameras and glittering diamonds. Marcus Thorne stood on a dais in his grand ballroom, a portrait of civic virtue, accepting an award for his generous contributions. The governor stood beside him, smiling for the cameras. "It is my honor," Thorne said. His voice smooth and confident, broadcast over the speakers to the assembled elite. "To give back to the community that has given me so much." At that moment, the ballroom doors swung open. Alastair walked in, flanked by 2 state troopers in full dress uniform. He was not wearing his sheriff's khakis. He was wearing his own dress uniform, crisp and decorated with the medals he had earned. Over a 30-year career, he was the very picture of implacable authority. A hush fell over the crowd. The music faltered and died. All eyes turned to the back of the room. Thorne froze at the podium, his smile tightening into a rictus of confusion and dawning horror. Alastair walked slowly, deliberately, down the center of the ballroom, his boots echoing on the marble floor. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were locked on Thorne. He stopped at the foot of the stage. He held up a portable speaker. "Marcus Thorne," Alastair's voice boomed, amplified and clear. "Before you accept your award, there's another voice I think everyone here should hear." He pressed play. Michael Miller's terrified, sobbing voice filled the opulent ballroom. Mum, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry." Panic erupted in Thorne's eyes. He lunged for the microphone, shouting, "What is this? Stop this! Security!" But the state troopers were already ascending the stage, blocking his path. The crowd stood in stunned, horrified silence, captivated by the raw agony pouring from the speaker. They heard it all: the water rights, the frame-up, the rendezvous in the desert. "He took the baby from her. And he shot the baby. He shot my little girl right in front of her." A collective gasp, a wave of revulsion, swept through the ballroom. Women brought their hands to their mouths. Men stared, their faces pale with shock. The governor took a half-step away from Thorne, as if he were radioactive. When the tape ended, the silence was absolute, profound. It was the silence of a tomb. Alastair looked up at Thorne, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. "Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice ringing with the authority of the law and the weight of 26 years of injustice, "you are under arrest for the murders of Sarah Miller, Noah Miller, Lily Miller, and an infant child. Lily Miller, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and for a darkness of the soul that defies human comprehension." The flashbulbs of the press, who had been cordoned outside, now erupted in a frenzy as they pushed past the velvet ropes. The arrest was a supernova, broadcast live across every news channel. Thorne, the titan of industry, the philanthropist, the friend of governors, was handcuffed on stage, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief. As they led him away, his eyes met Alastair's. In them, Alastair saw not remorse, but pure, unadulterated hatred. He had not just been arrested, he had been publicly crucified. His name, his legacy, his entire world, had been annihilated in the space of 3 minutes. Brought down by the voice of a dead man and the relentless tenacity of a small-town sheriff. The payoff was not just justice, it was a cleansing fire. The trial of Marcus Thorne was a media circus, a public vivisection of a man who had lived a lie. The cassette tape, once inadmissible hearsay, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case when Chloe Benson, no longer a ghost, took the stand. Her testimony, corroborating every detail of Michael's final words, gave the recording the legal weight it needed. The documents from the manila envelope sealed Thorne's fate. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His empire crumbled, his name became a synonym for evil, and the world he had built turned to ash. But for Alistair Finch, the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but the ghosts remained. A few weeks after the sentencing, he drove back out to the spot in the Mojave where the explorer had been found. The dune was smaller now, scarred by the excavation, but the desert was already working to reclaim it, the wind patiently piling grain upon golden grain. He had something with him. A small, simple granite marker he'd had made. It didn't bear the name Miller. It said, Sarah, Noah, Lily, and Lily Anna, finally at peace. 1998, he had learned the infant's full name from a birth certificate Chloe had kept. Another secret she had guarded. Lily Anna, a name that had never been spoken, a life that had never been counted. He set the stone at the base of the sun-bleached Joshua tree, the silent witness that had stood guard for all those years. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the desert wrapping around him. It was no longer a menacing silence, it felt respectful. He thought of Eleanor Vance. She had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, her face an unreadable mask of granite. She had listened to the tape, to Chloe's testimony, to the evidence that dismantled the memory of her son and recast him as a tragic, manipulated pawn in a much darker game. She never spoke to Alistair, not once. After the verdict, she had simply walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, her back ramrod straight. She had sold her house in Barstow and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address. Alistair didn't know if she had found a new kind of peace, or if she had simply chosen to live out her remaining years in a solitude of her own making, unable to reconcile the son she loved with the man he had become in his final terrifying hours. Perhaps some truths were too heavy to carry. Alistair found his own peace in the small things. The quiet of his office at the end of a long day. The familiar weight of his badge in his hand. He had solved his predecessor's great failure, but the cost had been immense. He had unearthed a family only to rebury them with the correct, horrifying story. He often thought of the locket they had found tangled in little Lily's ribs. He had cleaned it himself. It was a simple silver heart. Inside, on one side, was a tiny faded picture of Sarah, smiling and vibrant. On the other side, a picture of Noah, a gap-toothed grin on his face. It was a locket for a family of 3, from a time before the secrets, before the lies, before Marcus Thorne, before Lily Anna. A snapshot of a happiness that had been stolen. He kept the locket in his desk drawer, a small, cold piece of metal that served as a constant, haunting reminder. A reminder of the fragility of truth, the corrosive power of secrets, and the terrible price of justice. He had given the Millers a voice, but he would carry their echoes for the rest of his life. The desert had given up its dead, but their ghosts would walk with him forever, their silent screams a permanent whisper on the wind. The case was closed, but the emotional aftermath, like the desert itself, was vast, silent, and eternal.